My son looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're too old to make decisions anymore. Let me handle it." He said it calmly, as if he were doing me a favor, as if 66 years behind my back had quietly erased my right to think, choose, and decide. I remember noticing how steady his voice was, how sure. That was the moment I understood something important had already broken. I am 66 years old. I live alone in the house where I once raised him. I still pay my bills on time, remember passwords, read contracts line by line, and wake up without an alarm. My hands shake only when I'm cold. My mind does not shake at all. But that day, sitting across from my son at my own kitchen table, I was suddenly presented as a problem that needed management. He spoke slowly, the way people do when they think you might not follow. He told me I shouldn't worry about documents anymore, about money, about big things. He said it was time to rest, to trust him. He said people my age often make mistakes without realizing it. He even smiled once, softly, like a doctor delivering bad news with sympathy. I nodded. I have learned that nodding buys you time. For years I had been convenient. After my husband died, I didn't fall apart. I worked, I saved, I stayed quiet. I helped my son when he asked and sometimes when he didn't. I signed papers because he said they were routine. I listened when he explained the world to me, though I had lived in it longer than he had been alive. Somewhere along the way, my silence began to look like weakness to him. That afternoon, he slid a folder toward me. He said it would simplify things. Power of attorney. Temporary, of course. Just in case. He said it was responsible. He said, "You don't want to be making decisions you don't fully understand." I asked one question. Just one. I asked why he thought I didn't understand my own life anymore. He sighed. That sigh did more damage than his words. It carried impatience, superiority, relief even, like someone finally admitting what they'd been thinking for a long time. "Mom," he said, "you're 66. Be realistic." I folded my hands in my lap so he wouldn't see how still they were. I looked at the clock on the wall, the one I bought myself after my husband's funeral, because I needed something solid that kept moving. I listened. I let him finish talking. I let him believe he had already won. What my son didn't know was that I had raised a child, buried a husband, run a household, and survived losses he would never fully understand. I had learned patience, not because I was weak, but because patience lets people reveal exactly who they are. And once they do, you know what decision needs to be made. If you enjoy the stories here, dear, you're welcome to join our Patreon. There you'll find exclusive tales that never appear on YouTube, and new stories come out earlier than anywhere else. The link is just below. We're waiting for you. I did not always let him speak to me that way. There was a time when my son still waited for my opinion instead of correcting it. A time when my words carried weight simply because I had earned them. After my husband died, life did not pause to ask how I was coping. The bills came on schedule. The roof started leaking the same winter. The car broke down 2 weeks later. Grief had to fit somewhere between practical things. I learned quickly that no one was coming to rescue me, and strangely, that knowledge made me stronger. I went back to work 3 months after the funeral. Not because I was eager, but because routine kept my feet on the ground. I paid off what we owed. I learned to manage things my husband had always handled without ever making me feel small for not knowing them before. I asked questions. I read carefully. I made mistakes and fixed them quietly. No one applauded. I didn't need them to. My son was already an adult then, building his own life, testing his independence. At first, he admired my resilience. He used to say, "I don't know how you do it, Mom." Back then, his voice held respect. He listened. He even worried about me. That worry slowly changed its shape. It began with suggestions, then reminders, then gentle corrections. "You shouldn't bother with that. That's complicated, I'll handle it. It's easier if I do it for you." Each phrase was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't want to see. I helped him when he needed it. Money sometimes. Advice more often. I never asked for gratitude. I only asked for honesty. He thanked me less and explained himself more. Somewhere along the way, help became expectation, and expectation became entitlement. I noticed it in small things. He stopped asking before making plans that involved me. He started informing. He'd speak over me, then apologize with a smile. "Sorry, Mom. You know how this stuff is now." Now. That word lingered. I told myself it was just the way children grow up. That independence looks like arrogance from the outside. That patience was the better choice. I had already lost one important man in my life. I wasn't eager to lose another. But patience can blur into habit, and habit can teach people that you will always bend. By the time he sat at my table and told me I was too old to decide things, he wasn't being cruel. He was being honest. He truly believed it. I had allowed him to believe it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me very clear. The truth is, I did not become invisible overnight. It happened slowly, in ways that were easy to excuse and even easier to forgive. He started calling less, but when he did, the calls were efficient, short, purposeful. He asked how I was the same way one asks about the weather, out of politeness, not interest. If I answered honestly, he would redirect the conversation within seconds. If I said I was fine, he sounded relieved. When he came over, he walked through my house as if inspecting it. He commented on things that had never bothered him before. The old cabinets, the heater, the way I stacked papers. He said it wasn't criticism, just concern. He said he worried about my safety, my comfort, my future. Those are powerful words. They sound like love when you want them to. He began to repeat himself. At your age, these days, you don't need to deal with this anymore. Each phrase landed softly, but they landed. I noticed how he no longer asked what I wanted. He told me what would be best. If I hesitated, he frowned, as if my hesitation itself was proof of decline. Once, I corrected him about a payment he claimed I had missed. I showed him the receipt. He laughed and said, "See? This is exactly what I mean. You're getting defensive over nothing." Another time, I disagreed with a suggestion he made about selling a small piece of land I owned. He said I was being stubborn, emotional, attached to the past. I had heard those words before, just not aimed at me. The strangest part was how natural it all felt to him. There was no malice in his tone, no cruelty, just certainty. He believed he was stepping into a role that had been waiting for him, and I, apparently, was stepping out of mine. I started noticing how others followed his lead. Bank clerks looked to him when he spoke, even if I was the account holder. Contractors addressed him instead of me. He never corrected them. He placed a hand on my shoulder once and said, "I'll take care of it, Mom." And they nodded as if that settled everything. I told myself this was what families did, that roles change, that age rearranges authority. I reminded myself that he was my son, not my enemy, that he loved me in his own way. But love that requires you to disappear is not love. It is convenience. One evening, after he left, I sat alone and replayed our conversations in my head. Not the words, but the rhythm. How often he interrupted. How rarely he listened. How my sentences had grown shorter without me noticing. I realized I had been editing myself to make him comfortable. That was when I understood something quietly, but completely. My son wasn't taking control because I was failing. He was taking control because I had never stopped him. And once I saw that, I also saw something else. Control only works when you believe you have no alternative. I did not raise a son to rule me, and I did not live 66 years to hand over my life simply because someone spoke louder and younger. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept without trying to justify him to myself. Money was never the problem. Silence was. I had enough to live calmly, without fear of tomorrow. Not luxury, not excess, just stability earned over decades of careful choices. My son knew this. He knew every number better than he knew my favorite color. At first, he pretended not to care. Later, he stopped pretending. It began innocently. A short-term loan. A bridge, he called it. Just until things settle. They always needed settling. A business idea that required support. An unexpected tax issue. A temporary delay at work. Each request came with reassurance that this was the last time. I never demanded proof. I trusted him because I had raised him to be trustworthy. When I transferred money, he thanked me quickly, already thinking ahead. When I hesitated, he reminded me that family helps family. He never said I owed him, but he spoke as if the conclusion were obvious. Over time, he stopped explaining. He started assuming. The strangest shift was how my help turned into leverage. He would phrase things carefully. Since I'm already helping you with the paperwork, or given that I'm managing your finances now, I would correct him quietly. He would smile and say, "Of course, Mom. I just mean practically." Practically became permanent. He suggested combining accounts for simplicity. He said it would protect me if something happened. He talked about efficiency the way people talk about inevitability. When I asked questions, he answered with patience, edged with annoyance. He reminded me how confusing systems had become. He reminded me of my age. Once I asked him why he needed access to everything. He said, "Don't you trust me?" That question was a trap. Trust, I learned, is often used to shut down clarity. I noticed how dependent he had grown without ever admitting it. His plans assumed my support. His confidence rested on my compliance. He spoke of the future as if it were already organized around his authority. I was no longer a person in those plans. I was infrastructure. There was a moment, small but sharp, when it became undeniable. I told him I was considering a change, nothing dramatic, just a different arrangement for my savings. His reaction was instant, not curiosity, not concern, alarm. He asked who had put the idea in my head. He asked whether someone had confused me. He said decisions like that were dangerous at my stage. At my stage. I realized then that my independence frightened him, not because it endangered me, but because it endangered him. He had grown comfortable steering my life without resistance. My quiet cooperation had taught him that control was his right. That night, I sat at the same table where he had spoken to me like a child. I opened every folder, every statement, every document I had let him touch without question. I read slowly, carefully, the way I always had when something mattered. Nothing was stolen, nothing illegal. Everything was positioned, balanced just enough that I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I closed the last folder and folded my hands. I did not feel panic. I felt something steadier. Recognition. My son believed I was too old to make decisions. He had forgotten who taught him how to survive in the first place. The breaking point did not come with shouting. It came with paperwork. He invited himself over one afternoon, announced it rather than asked, brought coffee I didn't want and pastries I didn't eat. He spread documents across my table like a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. His confidence filled the room before his words did. "This is important," he said. "We need to finalize things." He spoke about responsibility, about protecting me from myself, about how quickly things can go wrong at my age. He kept saying "we," but everything he described required only my signature and his control. When I paused, really paused, and began to read instead of nod, his tone changed. "Mom," he said, sharper now, "you don't need to analyze every line. That's exactly what I'm talking about." I asked him what would happen if I chose not to sign. He laughed. Not kindly, not nervously. He laughed the way people do when they think resistance is pointless. "Why would you even think about that?" he asked. "You're too old to be making decisions like this." The words sat between us, heavy and undeniable. Too old. Not confused. Not tired. Too old. As if age itself were a disqualification. As if the years I had lived canceled the judgment I had earned through them. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger. Something colder. More precise. I asked him to repeat it. He hesitated, annoyed now. "I'm saying this isn't something you should be handling anymore. Let me take over." I stood up. Slowly. My knees complained, but my voice didn't. "I've handled my life since before you were born," I said. "Sit down." He looked startled, then irritated. He stayed standing. "You're being emotional," he said. "This is exactly why—" I raised my hand. He stopped mid-sentence, shocked more by the gesture than the interruption. I had never done that before. "You are not here to manage me," I said quietly. "You are here because you want control." His face hardened. He said I was being paranoid, ungrateful, difficult. He said people my age often resist help because they fear losing relevance. He said this was normal, that doctors even talk about it. Doctors. I realized then how carefully he had built this story. Not just for me, but for himself. In his version, he was the hero. The responsible son saving his mother from decline. Any resistance I offered only proved his point. When I told him I wouldn't sign anything that day, his patience snapped. "You're going to ruin everything," he said. "You don't understand what's at stake." I asked him what exactly was at stake for him. He didn't answer. He gathered his papers with sharp movements, already preparing for the version of events he would repeat later. At the door, he turned and said something I will never forget. "If you don't let me handle this now, you're going to regret it." I closed the door behind him without replying. My hands were steady. My heart was not racing. I felt oddly calm, like someone who has finally been given clear information. That evening, I did not cry. I made myself soup. I washed the dishes. I sat in my chair and thought. He believed fear would bring me back in line. He believed dependence was permanent. He believed age meant weakness. He had made one mistake. He assumed that because I had been quiet, I had been unaware. And because I had been generous, I would remain convenient. That night, I made a decision. Not out of spite. Not out of pride. Out of necessity. That night stretched longer than it should have. After he left, the house felt unusually quiet, as if it were listening. I moved from room to room without purpose, touching familiar things as if to reassure myself they were still mine. The arm of the sofa, the edge of the bookshelf, the window latch I had fixed myself years ago. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I replayed his words, not obsessively, but carefully. I examined them the way I once examined invoices, searching for what didn't add up. You're too old. You'll regret it. Let me handle it. None of those sentences were about concern. They were about urgency, about pressure, about closing a door before I could see what was behind it. I made tea and let it go cold on the table. My appetite had disappeared, but my mind was sharp. I realized something uncomfortable. He wasn't angry because I disagreed. He was angry because I delayed. Delay meant risk. Delay meant I might act independently. I sat down with a notebook I hadn't used in years. On the first page, I wrote the date. On the second, I wrote a simple question. What do I actually control? The answer surprised me. I controlled more than I had been led to believe. The accounts were still in my name. The property was still mine. The signatures were still mine to give or not give. Nothing irreversible had happened yet. He had been preparing for it, positioning himself carefully. But the final step required my consent. That was why he was frightened. The realization did not make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. If I did nothing, things would continue drifting in his direction. If I acted, there would be consequences. For him, for me, for the fragile peace I had preserved by staying agreeable. I thought of the years I had spent choosing harmony over honesty. I told myself it was love. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was fear of being alone. The line between the two had blurred long ago. I slept poorly. Not because I was anxious, but because my thoughts refused to soften. Each time I woke, the same calm certainty returned. I could no longer pretend this was temporary. This was not a misunderstanding to be cleared up with patience. This was a boundary that had already been crossed. In the morning, my phone showed a missed call from him. No message, just the call. It felt intentional. A reminder. I did not return it. Instead, I got dressed and went out. I drove slowly, deliberately, the way I always do. The city looked ordinary. People went about their lives without knowing that mine had quietly shifted direction. I found comfort in that. Big decisions do not need witnesses. I sat in my car for a moment before turning off the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I felt no rush. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt ownership over the next step. He thought regret would stop me. He thought fear would pull me back into place. He had no idea that fear had already done its worst and failed. What he didn't understand was simple. When a woman my age finally decides to act, it is not impulsive. It is not emotional. It is the result of a long, careful accounting. And once that accounting is done, there is no going back. By the third day, the noise around me had quieted. Not outside, inside. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped imagining apologies that would never come. I understood that whatever my son chose to feel about my silence was his burden, not mine. That realization alone felt like laying down a heavy object I had carried for years without noticing its weight. I spent that morning sorting through things I had postponed, not in a dramatic way, methodically, a drawer at a time, old insurance letters, bank envelopes, deeds, notes written in my own handwriting, steady and clear, from years when no one questioned my ability to decide. The evidence of a competent life was everywhere. I wondered how easily it had been ignored. My husband used to say that real strength shows up late, not at the beginning when energy is loud, but at the end when experience finally stops negotiating. He had said it once, casually, while fixing a door hinge. At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. I did now. I was not acting out of anger. Anger is noisy. This was quieter than that. This was alignment. Something in me had settled into its proper place, and the rest of my thoughts followed. I made a list, not of revenge, of protection, what I needed to secure, what I needed to separate, what I needed to reclaim. Each line was practical, almost boring. That was how I knew I was thinking clearly. Emotional decisions feel urgent. This felt deliberate. Another call came in that afternoon. This time he left a message. His voice was controlled, almost reasonable. He said we needed to talk. He said he was worried. He said I was overreacting and letting pride get in the way of common sense. He said he was only trying to help. I listened once. I didn't replay it. Help that demands surrender is not help. It is takeover with a polite label. I remembered the woman I had been at 40, at 50. How many times I had swallowed my instincts to keep the peace. How often I had been right and still chosen to stay quiet. That habit had aged me more than years ever could. I did not blame him entirely. I had trained him to expect compliance by offering it too easily. I had confused love with availability. Mothers are taught that sacrifice is virtue, but no one teaches us when sacrifice becomes erasure. Late in the afternoon, I sat by the window and watched a neighbor struggle with a broken grocery bag, oranges rolling across the sidewalk. I went out, helped her gather them, exchanged a few words, nothing important. When I came back inside, I noticed something strange. I felt present, not braced, not waiting. Present. That was when I knew I would not change my mind. This was not about punishing my son. It was about removing myself from a position where punishment was even possible. I was not taking something from him. I was taking myself back. I folded the list and placed it in my purse. I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I knew which conversations would be uncomfortable and which documents would require precision. None of it frightened me. What frightened him was the version of me he no longer controlled. He thought age had softened me. He was wrong. Age had clarified me. I did not tell anyone where I was going that morning, not because it was secret, but because it was mine. I chose clothes the way I always do when something matters. Simple, clean, familiar. Nothing that tried to prove anything. I checked my bag twice. Glasses, notebook, the folded list, my ID. My hands did not shake. That surprised me more than anything else. The building was quiet, professional, neutral. I had been there before, years ago, when my husband was still alive and decisions were made together. Walking in alone this time felt different, but not lonely. It felt correct. When they called my name, I stood up without rushing. The man across the desk looked at me the way professionals often do when they see gray hair, polite, cautious, already assuming the conversation would be simple. He was wrong. I told him exactly what I needed. No stories, no emotions, just facts. He asked careful questions. I answered them clearly. When he suggested alternatives, I listened. When something didn't sit right, I said so. At one point, he paused, looked at me more closely, and adjusted his tone. Not softer, more respectful. That moment mattered. We went through documents line by line. Authority, access, boundaries. What could be changed immediately, what required notice, what needed witnesses. I asked about consequences. Not for me, those I understood, but for others who had grown used to arrangements that benefited them, he explained calmly, without judgment. I nodded. I had expected consequences. I was prepared for them. There is a strange relief in choosing the harder path once you accept that there is no painless option left. The illusion of peace is often more exhausting than conflict ever could be. When I signed the first document, nothing dramatic happened. No thunder, no rush of triumph, just ink on paper. And yet, something shifted, not outwardly, internally. For years, decisions had been framed as things I was no longer capable of. In that quiet office, with my glasses low on my nose and my handwriting steady, I remembered how false that narrative was. We discussed timing, implementation, notifications. I asked what would happen if someone objected. He answered honestly. I asked what would happen if pressure was applied. He explained safeguards. I left with copies neatly arranged in a folder, heavier than paper should be. Not because of weight, but because of what they represented. Back in my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. My phone buzzed once. A message from my son, just a single line. "We need to talk today." I placed the phone face down. This was not something to be discussed. It was something already done. On the drive home, I noticed small things. A new cafe where an old shop had been. A woman crossing the street with her child, holding his hand too tightly. The world did not know what I had just done, and it didn't need to. At home, I placed the folder in a drawer I could lock. Not because I was afraid, but because respect sometimes needs structure. I made myself lunch. Simple food, familiar routine. I did not wait for another message. Later that afternoon, the calls began. Missed calls. A voicemail I did not open. Then another. I knew the tone before I heard it. Confusion first, then irritation, then urgency. He was realizing that something fundamental had changed. What he still didn't understand was this. I had not acted quickly. I had not acted impulsively. I had acted after years of watching, listening, and deciding whether silence was still serving me. It wasn't. And once that becomes clear, the decision makes itself. The next phase did not announce itself. It unfolded. That is something people rarely understand about real change. It does not crash into your life. It settles in and begins rearranging things quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realize the structure is different. By the end of that week, the practical consequences had started to appear. A payment he expected did not go through, not dramatically, just a short notification, an inconvenience, the kind of thing he would normally fix with a quick call, a confident tone, and my quiet approval. This time, the system did not bend. He called immediately. I watched the phone ring until it stopped, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. There was nothing to explain. The next call came an hour later, then a message. His words were careful, almost casual. He asked if I had changed something by mistake. He suggested a technical issue. He ended with a gentle reminder that he could handle it for me. I deleted the message. By the following day, the tone shifted. There was irritation now, poorly disguised as concern. He told me this was serious, that delays like this could cause problems, that I should have consulted him before making changes. He said I was being irresponsible. I read his message once, then put the phone down. Irresponsible. The word would have stung years ago. Now it sounded misplaced, like an accusation delivered to the wrong person. I spent that afternoon doing nothing remarkable. I watered the plants. I washed a load of laundry. I reread a few pages of a book I'd abandoned long ago. The world did not collapse because I refused to respond. That alone was instructive. On the third day, he came to the house without warning. I did not rush to the door. I finished drying my hands first. When I opened it, he looked tired in a way I had not seen before. Not physically, strategically. He tried reason. He said we should sit down like adults. He said I was letting emotions cloud my judgment. He said people would take advantage of me if I pushed him away. I listened. I let him speak. When he finished, I said one sentence. I've already taken care of it. His eyes narrowed. Taken care of what? My affairs, I said. Properly. The silence that followed was thick. He searched my face for uncertainty and found none. He asked what I meant. I told him I had restructured things, that access had changed, that decisions would remain with me. His reaction was not immediate anger. It was disbelief. You can't do that without telling me, he said. I just did, I replied. That was when his voice rose. He said I was sabotaging him. He said I didn't understand the consequences. He said I was proving his point about my judgment. He said I was making a mistake I wouldn't be able to undo. I noticed how quickly his concern disappeared once control was removed. I told him calmly that nothing illegal had happened, nothing reckless, that everything was documented, reviewed, and intentional. I told him I would not discuss details. You don't trust me, he said, almost accusing. I trust myself, I answered. That was the moment his mask slipped. He spoke faster then, sharper. He reminded me of everything he'd done for me. Of all the times he had helped. He said I was ungrateful, that I was punishing him for caring. I let the words pass through me. I had already done the accounting. His version of help had always come with conditions. My version had not. When he finally left, he did not slam the door. He walked out stiffly, as if already planning his next move. I knew he would not stop. People accustomed to access do not surrender it easily. That evening, I sat at my table and reviewed the documents once more. Everything was in order. Safeguards in place. Authority clear. I did not feel victorious. I felt prepared, because I understood something now that I hadn't before. The real shock would not come from what I had taken away. It would come from what I no longer provided. And once that absence settled in, there would be no argument left that could restore what he had lost. By the time he understood that pleading would not work, he had already moved on to planning. I could hear it in his voice the next time he called. It was steadier again. Too steady. He spoke as if the situation were temporary, a misunderstanding to be corrected with the right combination of pressure and persuasion. He said he had spoken to people, advisors, friends. He said they agreed I was being unreasonable. I did not ask who those people were. He told me I was putting myself at risk. That isolation was dangerous at my age. That I needed support, whether I admitted it or not. He said this slowly, carefully, as if placing stones on a scale he expected to tip. What he didn't realize was that I had already stepped off the scale entirely. He began showing up more often after that. Not every day, but often enough to remind me he was nearby. He knocked louder than necessary. He lingered at the door. He asked neighbors how I was doing. He framed it all as concern. Concern is an excellent disguise. It makes intrusion sound virtuous. Once he brought a pamphlet with him about planning for later life, assisted living, legal protection. He laid it on the table and waited for my reaction. I slid it back to him. "I'm not there yet," I said. He frowned. "You don't get to decide that alone." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "That's exactly what deciding means," I said. He stopped pretending after that. His words sharpened. He accused me of being stubborn, vindictive. He said I was ruining our relationship over paperwork. He said I was choosing pride over family. Family. Another word that sounds noble when used to demand obedience. What struck me most was not his anger, but his certainty that I would eventually give in. He spoke as if time were on his side, as if fatigue, loneliness, or guilt would wear me down the way they always had. He underestimated one thing: relief. Each day that passed without me explaining myself, justifying my choices, or absorbing his anxiety felt lighter than the last. I ate better, slept longer. I noticed the absence of tension in my shoulders when the phone was silent. I had not realized how much of my energy had gone into managing his expectations. He, on the other hand, began to unravel. Small things started slipping. He missed a deadline. A plan he'd spoken confidently about was suddenly on hold. He blamed external factors: bad timing, other people's mistakes, never his own dependence. One afternoon, he said something that told me more than he meant to. "You can't just cut me out," he said. "I built my life around this. Around this. Not around me. Around access." That was when I knew the damage was already done. Not by me, but by the assumption that I would always be available, always compliant, always there to correct the imbalance he refused to see. I told him nothing that day. There was nothing left to clarify. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down. A neighbor waved. I waved back. The world continued, indifferent to the shift in our family's internal order. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something quietly radical. What if this distance was not a loss? What if it was the first honest space we'd had in years? My son was still trying to regain control. He was making calls, rehearsing arguments, convincing himself that authority could be reclaimed through persistence. He had no idea that the decision he feared most was already behind me. From here on, all that remained was consequence. And consequences do not negotiate. The first real consequence arrived quietly, the way most truths do when they are unavoidable. He called early that morning. Too early. His voice no longer carried irritation or authority. It was tight, clipped, as if every word had to pass through something clenched. "There's a problem," he said. No greeting. No concern for how I was. Just the problem. I let him speak. Something hadn't gone through. A plan he had already committed to. An agreement made with confidence, backed by money he assumed would be there. He said it was temporary, that it would be resolved once I fixed whatever I'd changed. He said people were waiting on him, that this made him look unreliable. I noticed how quickly his discomfort became my responsibility in his mind. "I'm not fixing anything," I said. There was a pause, then disbelief. "You don't understand," he replied. "This affects my future." I almost laughed at that. Not out loud, internally, because that was exactly the point. For years, his future had been cushioned by my past, by my work, my savings, my restraint. He had grown used to stepping forward without checking whether the ground beneath him was actually his. He began explaining. Over-explaining, numbers, timelines, obligations. He spoke faster, as if clarity would force compliance. I listened until he ran out of breath. "When you made those plans," I asked calmly, Did you ask me? Silence. He tried another approach after that. He reminded me of sacrifices he'd made, of stress, of responsibility. He spoke as if adulthood itself were a favor he had done me. Then came the anger. "You're doing this on purpose," he snapped. "You're trying to teach me some kind of lesson." "No," I replied. "I'm correcting an imbalance." That was when his voice changed completely. "You can't do this to me," he said. "I need that support." Need. Not appreciate. Not value. Need. In that single word, everything became clear. He was not losing comfort. He was losing a foundation he had never built himself. And foundations, once removed, reveal how unstable the structure above them truly is. By the end of the week, the ripple effects multiplied. Another call. This one louder. More frantic. He said people were threatening penalties. That this could ruin him. He said I was being heartless. I reminded him once that nothing had been taken from him, only access, only expectation, only the illusion of entitlement. He hung up on me. That evening, a message arrived that surprised me with its honesty. "You're acting like you don't care what happens to me." I stared at the words for a long time before replying. "I care," I typed. "I just won't carry you anymore." He did not respond. Days passed. The silence between us stretched, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt informative. I learned, through small things, how deeply my absence affected him. A neighbor mentioned seeing him pacing outside his car. Someone else said he looked exhausted. He stopped showing up unannounced. The confidence drained out of his movements. When he finally came back to the house, it was different. He didn't bring papers. He didn't raise his voice. He sat down without being asked. His shoulders were tense, but his posture was no longer commanding. "This has gone too far," he said quietly. "We need to fix this." "We don't," I answered. He looked at me then with something close to fear. Not fear of me, fear of the reality settling in around him. "You don't get it," he said. "I don't have a backup." I nodded. "Neither did I when I was your age." That was the moment he understood. Not fully, not deeply, but enough to feel the shift. He left shortly after, without argument, without threats, without promises. He had run out of leverage, and for the first time in his life, charm and pressure were no longer working. That night, as I turned off the lights, I felt something unfamiliar and solid. Stability. Not the kind built on constant giving, the kind built on boundaries. My son had believed my age made me weak. What he was discovering now was far more unsettling. I had simply stopped holding him up. And once a grown man is forced to stand on his own, there is no way to pretend he isn't shaking. By the time he came back again, he was no longer pretending this was about my well-being. He arrived in the late afternoon, unannounced. But this time, he didn't knock. He rang the bell and waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. When I opened the door, he didn't step inside right away. That hesitation told me more than words could have. "We need to talk," he said. Not sharply, carefully. I stepped aside and let him in. I did not offer coffee. I did not sit until he did. Small things, perhaps, but I was done arranging myself around his comfort. He started with restraint. He said he had been under pressure, that things had spiraled faster than he expected, that I had caught him off guard. He spoke as if the problem were timing, not entitlement. Then the restraint cracked. "You didn't have to go this far," he said. "You could have warned me." "I did," I replied. "You just didn't listen." He paced the room, stopping near the bookshelf, running his hand along the spines as if grounding himself. He said I had embarrassed him, that people were asking questions, that he looked unstable, that this situation made him seem incompetent. I noticed how none of his worries involved me. "You're my mother," he said finally. "You're supposed to support me." That sentence used to disarm me. It used to pull something soft and guilty out of my chest. This time, it landed differently. "I supported you," I said, "for years. What you mean is that you expected it to continue without limits." He shook his head, frustrated. He said I was rewriting history, that I was exaggerating, that he never forced me to do anything, that everything had been mutual. Mutual. Another convenient word. I asked him one question. "If I had signed those papers, would you ever have given the control back?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. That was my answer. His tone changed then. The edge returned. He said I was being selfish, that I was choosing independence over family, that one day I would need him, and I would regret burning this bridge. I listened. I did not interrupt. When he finished, I said quietly, "I already needed you. I just didn't ask." That stopped him. I reminded him of the years after his father died, of how I handled everything alone while still helping him build his life, of how often I put his needs ahead of my own stability, of how rarely he noticed. He said nothing. His jaw tightened. "You don't see me as capable," I continued. "You see me as aging. Those are not the same thing." He snapped back that age changes people, that decline happens whether we admit it or not, that he was only being realistic. That was when I stood up. "I am not declining," I said. "I am refusing." The room went very still. He stared at me, and for the first time I saw it clearly. Not anger, not disappointment, but fear. The fear of someone realizing they have overplayed their hand. "You've ruined everything," he said quietly. Not accusing, almost stunned. "No," I replied. "I've stopped rescuing you." He demanded to know what I wanted. Apologies, control, revenge. He was still trying to frame this as a transaction. "I want you to live your life without leaning on mine," I said. "That's it." He laughed once, bitterly, said that was easy for me to say. Said he couldn't just reset his life overnight. "I know," I answered. Neither could I. He stood there for a long moment, then grabbed his jacket. At the door, he turned back and said something that might have hurt me once. "You think you've won." I shook my head. "This isn't about winning," I said. "It's about finally being honest." He left without another word. That evening, I sat alone in the quiet house and noticed something unexpected. I did not feel shaken. I did not feel triumphant. I felt intact. For the first time in a very long while, nothing in me was bracing for his reaction. I had stopped asking for permission to exist as a capable woman, and whether he ever understood that or not no longer determined my peace. The silence that followed his last visit lasted longer than I expected. At first, I thought he was regrouping, rehearsing another argument, waiting for the right moment to strike again. That had always been his way. Withdraw, calculate, return with a new angle. I stayed alert without being tense. There is a difference, and I had finally learned it. Days passed, then more. No calls, no messages, no surprise appearances. That was when I understood that something more serious had happened. The next sign came indirectly. A neighbor mentioned, casually, that she had seen him arguing on the phone outside his car, voice raised, face red. Another told me he looked thinner, distracted, like a man who wasn't sleeping. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need details. I knew the pattern well enough. When support disappears, reality does not rush in. It seeps. He showed up again on a Sunday evening, later than usual. He didn't ring the bell. He knocked softly, almost hesitantly. When I opened the door, he looked older. Not in years, he was still young, but in posture. The confidence that once entered the room ahead of him was gone. "I messed up," he said. "Not I'm sorry. Not yet. Just the admission." I stepped aside and let him in. He sat without being told. His hands rested on his knees, fingers interlaced too tightly. He stared at the floor for a long moment before speaking again. "I didn't realize how much I'd built around things that weren't actually mine," he said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of performance. I waited. He told me pieces of the story then. Not everything. Enough. Plans that had assumed my backing. Commitments made too confidently. Promises he could no longer keep. People who had stopped returning his calls once they realized he didn't have the leverage he claimed. "I thought I had time," he said. "I thought I could fix it." I noticed how carefully he avoided saying you. He was no longer accusing me. He was reckoning with himself. "You told me I was too old to make decisions," I said gently. "Do you remember that?" He nodded. Slowly. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, but there was no conviction left in the sentence. It sounded like a habit, not a belief. "Protection doesn't take someone's voice," I replied. "It doesn't take their authority. It doesn't require fear." He swallowed. His eyes stayed on the floor. "I panicked," he admitted. "When you stopped, when everything changed, I didn't know how to handle it." I believed him. That surprised me. Not because he was innocent, he wasn't, but because he was finally telling the truth. He had relied on my steadiness for so long that he mistook it for something guaranteed. When it disappeared, he was forced to face the parts of his life he had never secured himself. "I need help," he said eventually. The words were quieter than all the others. I took a breath before answering. "I won't manage your life," I said, "and I won't undo what I've done." He looked up then, alarm flashing across his face. "But," I continued, "I'm willing to have a relationship with you that isn't built on dependence." The tension in his shoulders shifted. Not relief. Something closer to resignation. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "I didn't either," I said. "I learned." We sat in silence after that. Not awkward. Just heavy with adjustment. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand forgiveness. He simply said, "I didn't expect you to stand your ground." "I didn't expect to need to," I replied. After he left, I sat alone and considered the strange turn of events. I had not ruined him, despite the title he might give the story. I had removed a false support and let the consequences fall where they belonged. What came next, for him, would depend on what he chose to build without leaning on me. What came next, for me, was already clear. I had my life back. After that conversation, something settled into place that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. I woke up the next morning without the familiar heaviness in my chest. No replaying words, no bracing for the phone to ring, no calculating what mood he might be in if we spoke again. The silence was no longer sharp. It was neutral, even kind. I went about my day slowly, deliberately. I made breakfast instead of skipping it. I watered the plants and noticed which ones had grown despite my neglect. Life had been doing that all along, I realized, continuing quietly while I was busy managing someone else's balance. My son did not call for several days after that. When he did, the tone was different, shorter, careful. He did not ask for anything. He did not give instructions. He spoke as if unsure of the rules now, and for the first time, that uncertainty was his to carry. I did not mistake this for transformation. People do not change overnight, especially when entitlement has lived in them for years. But something had cracked, and once cracked, it cannot be made whole again in the same shape. What surprised me most was not his adjustment, but mine. I had expected guilt, regret, a sense of having gone too far. None of that came. Instead, there was a quiet pride, not loud, not boastful, but steady, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. I realized how much of my identity had been tied to being needed, to being useful, to being the one who smoothed things over. When that role fell away, I didn't disappear with it. I remained. At 66, that realization mattered. I began making decisions again without announcing them to anyone. Small ones. What to cook, where to go, what to postpone. I did not explain. I did not justify. The freedom was subtle but profound. One afternoon, I sat with a cup of tea and thought about the words he had used weeks ago. "You're too old to make decisions." I turned them over, examined them from all sides. What he had really meant was simpler. "You're too old to stop me." He had been wrong. Age had given me something he didn't account for: perspective. I no longer needed approval to validate my choices. I no longer feared discomfort enough to avoid truth. I had learned that peace built on self-erasure is not peace at all. When my son visited again, he looked around the house differently, as if noticing it for the first time. He commented on nothing, corrected nothing. He sat, spoke, left. It was strange. It was also appropriate. We were no longer performing our old roles. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my face. The lines were still there, the gray hair, the evidence of time. But behind my eyes was something I hadn't seen in years: authority. Not borrowed, not granted, earned. I had not ruined my son. I had ruined a version of him that depended on my silence. What remained was his responsibility to himself. As for me, I had reached an age where I finally understood this. Dignity is not something you demand. It is something you stop giving away. And once you stop, the world adjusts, whether it likes it or not. I did not hear the phrase "you ruined him" from my son. It came later, through someone else, softened and distorted by distance. A relative, trying to be kind, told me he was struggling, that things hadn't worked out the way he planned, that my decision had hit him hard. I thanked her for telling me and changed the subject. I have thought a lot about that word since then. Ruined. It suggests something fragile, something that cannot survive contact with reality. If a grown man's life collapses because his mother stops carrying it, then what existed before was not strength. It was dependence wearing a suit. My son did not lose his intelligence, his health, his hands, his ability to work, think, choose, rebuild. He lost access. He lost a shortcut. He lost the certainty that someone else would absorb the consequences of his risks. That is not ruin. That is adulthood arriving late. As for me, life became quieter. Not empty, quieter. I stopped anticipating his moods. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I stopped filtering my decisions through the question of how they might affect him. I learned something surprising in those weeks. Peace does not announce itself. It shows up in the absence of tension, in the way your shoulders drop without permission, in the way your thoughts no longer race to justify your existence. I was still a mother. I did not stop loving him. Love does not vanish when you remove entitlement from it. If anything, it becomes clearer, more honest, less transactional. We speak now occasionally, carefully, like people learning a new language. I no longer rush to fill silences. I no longer correct his discomfort. If he wants advice, he asks. If he doesn't, I remain quiet. That choice is his. The boundary is mine. Sometimes I think about the woman I was before all of this, the one who nodded to keep the peace, who mistook endurance for virtue, who believed age required apology. I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do at the time. But I am not her anymore. At 66, I understand that wisdom is not softness. It is clarity. It is knowing when to stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from your confusion. I made one decision that changed everything. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. I chose myself without asking permission. I chose dignity over convenience. I chose truth over fear. If my son was shocked, it was because he believed the story he told himself for too long, that age makes women smaller, quieter, easier to manage. It doesn't. It makes us precise. If you are reading this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this. It is not too late to reclaim yourself. Not at 50. Not at 60. Not at 70. The world will adjust when you stop shrinking for it. And if my story spoke to you, if you recognized yourself somewhere between the silence and the decision, don't keep that recognition to yourself. Say something. Share it. Let other women know they are not alone in choosing themselves, no matter how late they were told it was.